right, I think we are ready to go. Hello and a very warm welcome here from Berlin. Welcome to today's Atlantik-Brücke digital event entitled Rebuilding US-German Relations Harder Than It Appears. And it's my distinct honor and privilege to welcome our special guest today, Ambassador Stephen Pfeiffer, who will be introduced in more detail in just a minute. And of course, our moderator today, Annett Meiritz, who is the US correspondent for Handelsblatt Media Group and also a young leader alumna of Atlantik-Brücke. Very much looking forward to that discussion, which is timely and I think urgent, as we are following up actually on an op-ed which was published recently, actually on the 25th of March at Brookings by Ambassador Pfeiffer with that very same title, Rebuilding US-German Relations Harder Than It Appears. And of course, there are still some hard issues that we will have to deal with in that transatlantic partnership. Of course, after President Biden was elected and inaugurated, there was a sigh of relief here on the German side, but we do realize that are a couple of issues which still, remain to be discussed. First and foremost, of course, the Nordstrom II issue, also a transatlantic take on China, transatlantic China policy. How may that look like? Actually, Ambassador Pfeiffer in his paper wrote, building that relationship back, that German-US relationship, and not letting things get derailed by difficult issues that could divide the two allies will require flexible diplomacy, and that each takes some account of the other's interests and domestic pressures. So I'm very curious to find out more about how that diplomacy, this diplomatic solutions in different policy fields may look like. Very much looking forward to the discussion, and please don't be shy and join in, ask your questions, and please use the raise your hand button. With that, without any further ado, we'd like to hand over to you, Annett. Thank you so much for moderating today. Stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for this kind introduction. It's always a pleasure working with Atlantik-Brücke, and I'm looking forward to open the mic, so to speak, in a minute to Ambassador Pfeiffer. I'm very sure you're all very familiar with his impressive biography. He's the former US ambassador to the Ukraine. He's a special assistant to the president. And right now, I heard he's in Berlin. He's with the Bosch Foundation. And before we go into our discussion, our guest will present a few of his thoughts. So we have kind of a basic for our discussion when we open to our live Q&A later. So Ambassador Pfeiffer, the virtual stage is yours.
Well, David, and thank you very much for having me today. Let me just give maybe 10 minutes of a description of how I see US-German relations and the effort to revive those. But I'll begin with the observation that the relationship between Washington and Berlin went through a pretty difficult 4 years during the Trump presidency. And I go back and sometimes to a colleague at Brookings, Tom Wright, who actually went back and looked at Donald Trump's earliest thoughts on foreign policy. And you can go back and you can find this in the 1980s. There were two consistent themes. He did not like military alliances, which he believed allies exploited and the US bore the cost for. And he did not like multilateral trade agreements, and he thought trade relationships had been distinctly disadvantageous to the American producers. And I think in a way, Germany found itself in the crosshairs on both counts. First, the question of defense spending relative to the 2% target of NATO, and also the consistent trade surplus. And clearly there was very little personal chemistry between Donald Trump and Chancellor Merkel. And we saw, I think, that in what I really regard the president's pettiness was last year after the chancellor declined to come to a G7 summit meeting at Camp David during the pandemic. The president ordered the withdrawal of 10,000 American troops from Germany, a decision, by the way, that was halted and then reversed by the Biden administration. So I think Biden, his election brings hope for a revival of US-German relations. I would say he is the most transatlanticist president we've had probably since George H.W. Bush 30 years ago. And certainly the sense I have here in Berlin is that Berlin also wants to restore the bilateral relationship. So that's a good starting point. But I think both sides are going to face some challenges in reviving the relationship. One is the legacy of the Trump 4 years and the lingering concern here in Germany about that. So here are 4 or 5 questions I've heard from Germans, including in German government. One question, what is the new normalcy in America to the extent that the Biden presidency represents normalcy? What does that actually mean? And is that normalcy accepted by the 74 million Americans who voted for Donald Trump last November? What to expect from the Republican Party now? Has it abandoned a more traditional bipartisan stance on foreign policy questions? Will Donald Trump or will Trumpism return to power in 2024? And can the United States, can Americans be trusted? Now, these are somewhat painful questions for an American, but I understand them. And in fact, I think many Americans would have similar questions. We clearly have work to do in the United States on our democracy. And I think the hope is that on the part of the Biden administration, that with some early successes, the vaccination program, which appears to be going quite well, the impact of the COVID relief measures that were passed earlier, and then an infrastructure bill, if those have the desired effect, both in dealing with COVID, but also reviving the American economy, perhaps that allows the ability for the Democrats to recapture part of that Trump electorate and perhaps even bring the Republicans back to a more centrist course. And I think that's the hope. We'll have to see how that plays out. But certainly early moves by the Biden administration were well received here in Berlin. The decision to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, to rejoin the World Health Organization, to re-engage with the United Nations Human Rights Commission. And last week, the American ambassador to the UN said that the United States would seek a seat on the commission. The very early reaffirmation by President Biden of the US commitment to NATO and to Article 5, the article that says an attack against one will be considered an attack against all. And as I noted, not only a reversal of the Trump decision on withdrawing troops, but as Secretary Austin said when he was here about 10 days ago, adding 500 troops in Germany. Also welcome were the decisions to extend the new Strategic Arms Reductions Treaty and the effort which is now ongoing to bring the United States back into the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran. So I think there's a good beginning, but when you look at the agenda between Washington and Berlin, there are several issues where I would think we have to agree the American and German views are not aligned. One is Nordstrom II. And my impression after being here for 3 months is the German government, perhaps unenthusiastically, but the German government does intend to complete the pipeline. What I've heard in conversations is concerns that were the government to stop the pipeline now, Germany could find itself basically being stuck with all or part of a bill for 10 billion euros for the sunk costs in the pipeline. And I think it's also understandable that a decision now to reverse course on the pipeline would be very awkward to execute politically. And so I think that needs to be understood in Washington, but also in Berlin, there needs to be understanding that there really is strong opposition to the pipeline. And that opposition in Congress is bipartisan, including now a push for sanctions and some pushing for sanctions that would extend to German and or other European companies. And I think this puts a dilemma for the Biden administration, which it opposes Nordstrom II, but it also wants to revive the US-German relationship. And I think it understands that sanctioning the pipeline or sanctioning German companies would make that very difficult. And you saw this when the president last Thursday was asked about the question of Nordstrom II, where he made very clear, there are issues here involving allies, even though he's opposed to it. So I think if this is badly handled by the two sides, we'll have a rift between the United States and Germany over the question of sanctions. The pipeline may or may not be completed. It could undermine broader US-EU coordination on sanctions against Russia that go back 7 years. And Ukraine could find itself left out in the cold. So in my op-ed, what I urged, and I've urged elsewhere, is can Washington and Berlin find some kind of a compromise, which I believe would involve some tangible benefit for Ukraine, perhaps an extension of the current contract for transit of gas through Ukraine, but something that would allow the Biden administration to invoke waivers and not impose sanctions on German or European companies, and then allow Nordstrom II to be completed. I think that's possible, but I do worry that time may be getting short. And let me just make one observation. If Russia does in fact use its military force to invade Ukraine, I think all bets are off, and you'll see, very strong U.S. opposition to Nord Stream II. A second area, I think, where there's a difference is China, where the United States looks at China now as the main strategic challenger to the United States. And there's a range of issues there. There's trade issues, there's how China human rights questions, and there's a very real military concern that would China try to reunify Taiwan through use of force. The impression I think here is that when Germany looks at China, it sees China primarily as a trade partner, and to some extent that's understandable because China is Germany's largest trade partner. But it was noticed in Washington that Germany and the European Union pushed through the investment deal with China without taking the time to talk to the administration. But I think there is a legitimate question here, which certainly German business interests are important, but I think Washington will question, does Berlin embed those interests in a broader strategic approach, a broader strategic policy towards China that does look at things like China's human rights, that does look at how China uses things like the Belt and Road Initiative, and looks at what China's trying to achieve geopolitically in the Indo-Pacific region. I think one area there will be a difference, and there already is over the question of Huawei and 5G and the security of that network. And there's one area, though, I think where maybe cooperation will be possible, and that is decoupling the American and Chinese economies. Now, I don't believe the Biden administration is talking about that in the terms that Donald Trump envisaged, which was a huge separation and bringing back a lot of production in the United States. But I do think the Biden administration does want to decouple on some other areas and return production in the United States or to other Western countries in certain areas. They would include rare earths processing, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, areas where there's a feeling that the supply chain should be anchored in the West so that we're not solely dependent on China. And that seems to me that while the United States has that concern about protecting the American economy, that might also be a concern in Germany and Europe, and there may be areas there for cooperation. A third area, I think, where there's going to be a difference is defense. Joe Biden will be more tactful than Donald Trump, but the question of how much money Germany devotes to defense and the capabilities that it provides NATO will remain an issue. And to be sure, there's been a significant increase here. German defense spending now is about 50% more than it was in 2014, but it still falls well short of the 2% goal. And it's simply a fact that US attention now is shifting towards Asia and China, and you're going to see a shift also in American military attention and American military dollars. That doesn't mean that the United States will abandon NATO, it will not, but America will basically expect allies to pick up a greater share of the load. And that does lead to a related question, which is, do Washington and Berlin have the same threat perception regarding Russia? And do they share the same understanding of threat perception as it's seen in countries such as the Baltic states, Poland, and elsewhere in Eastern Europe? And this then gets into questions not just about defense spending, but how do we view the Russian challenge? What's the place of sanctions, for example, in how the West engages with Russia? And are there certain steps by the Russians that are unacceptable? Do we have some shared understanding on that? I think there's one last question that comes up on defense and related specifically to Russia, which is the nuclear sharing issue. And the question about, will Germany take the steps to define a replacement for the Tornadoes so that it can continue to participate in nuclear sharing programs? And I think here the main concern is that if there are any changes to nuclear sharing, what Washington would want to see is those changes take place as a result of a NATO decision, not as a result of a unilateral decision. So I think there's some tough questions out there. It's clear, though, I think that both Washington and Berlin want to work together and revive the relationship. And I think it means they just need to understand some things. First of all, they share a lot of areas where their interests converge. For Berlin, an America anchored in NATO is key to European security. And for Washington, I would say that Germany is seen as the main player in the European Union, especially after Brexit, at a time when you could see a possible expansion in the US-EU agenda. So just a brief comment on trade relations. I think they'll improve. We've already seen the United States and European Union suspend the retaliatory tariffs that were imposed on Airbus and Boeing. I think there's going to be common ground now on questions regarding WTO reform and the appellate board, but I'm not sure we're going to solve all issues. I think President Biden's going to be sensitive to domestic constituencies. And what you hear a lot is even talking to people at the State Department, is a foreign policy that works for the middle class and the American worker. And what that may mean in reality is, on some areas where I think Europe would like to see American concessions on trade, those concessions may be slower to come. And I hope that's seen here in part as, that's also part of the effort to win back a certain segment of the voters that were traditionally Democratic voters that defected to Donald Trump in 2016 and in 2020. So again, I think other areas where Germany can be partners with the United States combating climate change, the Biden administration is shaping up to be the most eco-friendly administration we've ever had. Things like how do you deal with future pandemics, and maybe even deepening US-EU cooperation more broadly. I believe the Biden administration would welcome the European Union as a partner that could manage global challenges, and even if it's on some issues we're going to disagree. But that does require a European Union that can act in a political way that reflects both its size and its economic weight. And I think that in part is going to depend on German leadership within the European Union. So let me just say, I think US-German relations will get back to a better state, but it's going to require that Berlin and Washington manage a few challenging questions. And in so doing, I think each needs to be sensitive to the domestic considerations that the other has to deal with. And Annett, why don't I stop there and turn it over to you for questions?
Thank you for this big picture, but also very detailed keynote. And again, I encourage everyone to collect your questions if you have one, and I'm going to open up the live question answer session around 10:30. Stephen, I'm interested in, soon we will approach the first 100 days of the Biden administration. And the newspapers will be full of analysis, but I'm interested in your opinion. Is there anything so far that surprised you the most, or that you simply didn't see coming, that Biden decided recently?
Well, let me, and this is shaped by, Brookings asked me to write a paper, which I was working on over the weekend, about Biden's first 100 days. And I guess what I found interesting is looking at how the president has addressed Russia, where he came into office very clearly saying, and in contrast, I think, to President Trump, that Russia needed to be held accountable for egregious misbehavior, for interfering in the US elections, for human rights violations, things like that. But he also talked about trying to cooperate on areas where US and Russian interests intersected. And I guess what I've been surprised, and actually happily surprised, is that he's emphasized that second track as well. So already on the first day of his presidency, the first full day of his presidency, he agreed to extend the new Strategic Arms Reductions Treaty for 5 years, basically accepting an offer that Vladimir Putin made about 16 months ago. And even though I think the calls that he's had with Putin have been fairly difficult, and he's been very clear from the readouts of those calls where he's talked about American concerns about Russia, for example, Russia, what it's doing with regards to Ukraine. He's talked about concerns about the 2020 election interference. He's also tried to stress, there are areas to work together, arms control, strategic stability. I'd add a couple other questions out there. Afghanistan, now that the president has decided to leave Afghanistan and American and NATO forces will be out of the country by September, I think there's an American and Russian interest in working together to do what we can to ensure stability in the country, that it doesn't devolve into chaos. And for the Russians, I mean, it'll be chaos closer to their borders than it is to the United States. And I thought it was also interesting that last week he offered a summit meeting. So I think it's been interesting, and it shows to my mind that some of the projections that you saw after Biden won the election, that it was going to be a much tougher American policy towards Russia, I think it's there, but he's also been careful to define a path that would allow the sides to manage some of the issues that presumably neither side wants to see get out of hand, and might even open up some ways later on for some serious discussions on problem areas. It's not going to be a reset. But I think the term they're talking about now is to develop a relationship that would be stable and predictable. And right now, that would not be a bad thing between Washington and Moscow. Definitely.
I mean, you already mentioned that it's the situation at the Ukraine and Russian border is within the last weeks. Yeah, it's short before escalation, I would say. But how does DC see the role of Germany right now? Like, what are the expectations towards Germany when it comes to the Russia conflict? We talked about Nord Stream already. That's a big issue. But is there anything else apart from that? Because the diplomatic efforts so far between France and Germany and Russia, they didn't come a long way. So what are the expectations on the role of Germany?
Yeah, no, well, I think there will be hope that France and Germany will continue that role. I mean, yes, the Normandy process has not resolved the conflict in Donbass, but I don't think anybody in Washington regards that as the fault of either Germany or France. It's the fault of the Russians, who at this point in time do not seem to want to resolve that conflict. But I think clarity from Germany, I guess two things. One, there was probably disappointment in the statement that was issued, I think about 10 days ago or maybe 2 weeks ago, by the French and German ministries, where it called kind of on both sides to de-escalate the situation. Whereas in Washington, the view is really, no, there's a crisis going on now because the Russians have built up their military forces in a way we haven't seen in 7 years. Chancellor Merkel, I think, corrected that when she made her call to Putin and called for him to wind down the deployments and de-escalate the situation. And it looks like that both Chancellor Merkel and President Macron repeated that on Friday. So I think that kind of clear messaging is useful. You know, the one thing I think, and I'm not sure it's being done on either side, or perhaps it's being done out of sight. In my mind, it's not yet clear whether what we're seeing around Ukraine is saber rattling designed to make the Ukrainians nervous and to sort of test the West reaction, or whether the Russians are actually getting ready to invade. I tend to think it's more the former, but I don't exclude the latter. And it might well be that Vladimir Putin is not yet decided. And so what I hope is happening behind the scenes is that people like Biden and Merkel and Macron are being pretty specific in communicating to the Russians. These are the kinds of things that will happen if you go into Ukraine, because I think there may be a chance to affect that calculation. And so to the extent that there are warnings going with specific consequences threatened, and my guess is it's probably a little bit easier for the Americans to do that, primarily because a lot of the consequences are economic. And we have to bear in mind on the American side that when you're talking about economic sanctions, Europe has more at stake than the United States, simply given the larger trade relationship with Russia.
I think it's a very interesting thought that you mentioned, like testing the reaction of the West. And it's not only Russia and the Ukraine. We have the China-Taiwan situation. We have the Iran nuclear program. So there are right now several big crises looming at once. Do you think in all those global crises, there might even be a chance for a stronger transatlantic cooperation, putting the divisiveness aside for a moment? So do you think in the short term, there might be a stronger mutual reaction from both sides of the Atlantic?
I think it's possible, and I hope so. And I think these are some of the issues. I mean, one of the things that unfortunately is just a feature of our system is we tend to be slow, particularly when you go from a transition from a Republican to a Democrat, or a Democrat to a Republican. It takes time for the new president to get his or her team in place. And so just last week, we had the nomination of Karen Donfried as the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. Probably by May, the full team will be in place. And then I think you can explore it at a more granular level, at a more detailed level, some of the ways to expand U.S.-European cooperation and build on a fairly decent basis as regards, for example, how do you respond to Russia? And my guess is that from Washington, there will also be a desire to have a conversation, how do we deal with China? Are there certain things where America and Europe share interests in responding to how China behaves? And I don't think people are looking for a standing NATO naval force in the South China Sea or in the Pacific Ocean, but there may be some ways where we can cooperate that would be of specific interest for the United States because of this competition I think we see emerging with China, but also would be smart policies on the part of European countries.
one interesting thought I had, like I was just on a reporting trip in Florida, and it seemed to be very far away from DC. But when you are traveling through the US, you really have the feeling of a new beginning. Like the US is kind of reinventing itself right now. On the other hand, you see Europe struggling with all those crises, the pandemic, a vaccine program that doesn't really work, the Brexit, and all those other problems. Do you sometimes think that, or what is your opinion on, is Europe still a reliable partner for the US in regard, like putting into regard that the US is kind of getting out of the crisis stronger and Europe is still struggling with their own crisis?
You know, it's interesting when you talk about specifically about the pandemic crisis. I mean, I go back to a year ago and look at it, and many countries in Europe, I thought, managed it much better than we did. I mean, even though I noticed that yesterday Germany marked, I think it was 80,000 people lost due to COVID. But if you look at that on a per capita basis, you know, I mean, I wish America had that record, because there'd be about 200,000, 225,000 more Americans alive today. The way I read what happened with COVID was that the European Union spent a little bit too much time negotiating a cheaper price. And while they were doing that, the United States and others were buying up and signing delivery contracts, so that Europe found itself back in the queue. I think that'll pass. And we'll see. I mean, I do hope that, and this will depend, I think, largely on the success of the COVID relief package, but if there's also, it's followed up by a strong infrastructure bill, you know, there's a chance, I think, for the United States to do some significant domestic revival, improving infrastructure, and then modernizing infrastructure, for example, making broadband accessible to everyone. I mean, I think, to my mind, that is really essential if we want to create equal opportunities for school kids. But it may also bring about, I'm hoping, a political revival and a return to political normalcy, and I'll put that in quotation marks, in the United States. Again, if people begin to see that government really can deliver in a positive way, responding to a major challenge. And I hope that that's the kind of thing which also then reduces the appeal of Trumpism.
But when we look to Germany, like on a day like this, everyone is talking about the Green Party and also about the fight in the Christian Democratic Union. How do you think the elections in September are going to impact the transatlantic relations? And how are your contacts in DC? Like, how are the administration officials in DC look to these elections?
Yeah, no, I think they're watching that. But I guess from my perspective, I'm not sure I see, however the German voter decides, I don't think it will be a bad outcome for the United States. I have to say, my perspective of the Green Party is the first time I met a member of the Green Party was when I was on the NATO desk in 1982 or 1983, having to talk to Petra Kelly about why we were deploying Pershing II and ground-launched cruise missiles in Germany. The Green Party attitude has changed on a lot of these questions. And my guess is, you know, there will be some differences of opinions, but I think whatever coalition emerges after September, my guess is it will not be a difficult one for Washington to work with.
But still, you mentioned that there's sometimes a certain disappointment from the Biden administration to Germany that the country is supposed to deliver more and kind of making more compromises and for example, with the Nord Stream issue. So what do you think would be something that Germany is supposed to deliver within this year, even if we are in an election year? What is something that's realistic in the short term?
I would guess the focus now might be on a couple of questions. You know, one is very strong messaging to the Russians. You know, and I think there really is an opportunity right now, because again, I'm not sure Vladimir Putin has decided what he wants to do. So it seems to me that it's in the interest of both Europe and the United States to be sending the strongest possible message now to try to change that calculation in the Kremlin towards the costs of actually doing something. And you know, I mean, if at the end of the day he just planned to do saber rattling, we don't lose anything. But you know, if we could turn off a decision on invasion, and I think there will also be, and it will be done in a more tactful manner, but there will be a feeling in the United States as American attention shifts to the Pacific, can Europeans and can Germany, as the largest economy, do more for Europe's defense? And I've heard some people, and I agree with this on one level, that 2% may not be the best metric by which to measure things, but I don't think we have any other metric at the point. So is there some way, even if it doesn't meet the 2%, that Germany can sort of say, look, we are making a greater contribution?
I would like to give our audience the opportunity to ask you a few questions. Let me just quickly check whether I see any raised hands. Of course, I already received a couple of direct messages, but I think the easiest way would be to raise your hand, and then I can see you, and then I can ask you to unmute you. So are there any questions right now on this variety of topics we already tackled or beyond that? There, okay. I pick randomly, so it doesn't matter whether your name is special or not, like, or whether you have a great Zoom background. So first of all, I see Frank Schuppert. You're probably in your office right now.
Yes, I am.
Yeah, please unmute. You already unmuted yourself, so I'm muting myself, and please go ahead with your question.
Thank you very much for letting me participate in this. I'm a physician living in Kassel with strong ties to the US. And I would like to ask Ambassador Pfeiffer, what is it exactly that he hears when he talks to German politicians, why Germany isn't doing more to defend itself? Is there still some reference to the past, or is it the feeling Germany has done enough? Because what more is there to see than what is currently happening at the Russian-Ukraine border that should make Germany to do more to defend itself?
Yeah, I guess I come away with a couple of impressions. That one is that we still between the United States and Germany, there's a difference in the threat perception with regards to Russia. And I wonder sometimes if, the US sensitivity tends to be shaped considerably by the views of the Baltic states, Poland, those countries that actually are close to and actually border on Russian territory. And sometimes I wonder if the memory of West Germans who spent many years on the front line of the Cold War prior to reunification and the breakup of the Warsaw Pact, if they've lost some of that feeling about how nervous you can be when you're sort of bordering a potentially adversarial state like the Soviet Union or Russia. The other part, which I haven't really understood and I'm still a little bit perplexed about, is I think when I hear there's still this sort of sense of war guilt, which I understand from World War II. The part I have a harder time understanding, though, is the war guilt seems to be felt specifically towards Russia. When if you look at a country like Ukraine or Belarus, in World War II on a per capita basis, they suffered much more badly than the Russians did. And so I'm trying to understand why that war guilt sort of argues for a little bit release for Moscow, but doesn't also seem to apply to the other countries. So I think those are two considerations. There's, I think, just sort of this general sense that in Germany, the military is not seen as the answer. And I would like to be in a world where the military is not the answer, but I do think in some cases, if you do not have the proper military preparations, you may find that the other side makes the military the answer. And let me say here, when I look at Russia, I don't think that there's a big chance of a Russia-NATO conflict. The scenario that people worry about most is would the Russians do something in one of the Baltic states? And I believe that possibility is very small. But if we were having this conversation, say 9 or 10 years ago, I think I would have said that the possibility was zero. And it's the trend that has people in Washington worried.
Okay, I see next, Carsten Owens. Did I pronounce that correctly? Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
The virtual stage is yours as well.
Thank you very much. So yeah, so many challenges for transatlantic relations. So it's really already a challenge to pick the right ones first. So besides everything you already elaborated on, I wonder what your opinion is on two fields. First of all, the opportunity for a joint policy on digitalization and innovation. So if we look at the challenges we all face, and on the one hand, the same value-based systems that we have with regards to data security, to a potential for a joint innovation agenda on robotics, on quantum technologies, on space technologies, I wonder if you see in the near future a bigger chance for a joint transatlantic agenda on these fields. And the second issue is more at our front door. This is the Middle East. So under the last president, the political landscape in the Middle East changed dramatically. On the one hand, we see positive signs with the Abraham Accords. On the other hand, we see a dramatic escalation when it comes to nuclear Iran. And Europe for many years was very reluctant on both fields and was a little bit out of the game. And now we have talks again in Vienna. Nonetheless, Iran is even further escalating the situation, and the E3 here in Europe dramatically also came out with a negative statement. But what is your opinion on these two fields, Middle East and innovation and digitalization, about a real potential for a reset and a new start for a joint transatlantic agenda? Thank you.
Okay, good question. And I like your background. I'm from I was born in San Francisco. No, on the Middle East, I think on the Iran question, it was a mistake for the United States to leave the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, as evidenced by the fact that 3 years ago, Iran would have needed a year to produce enough highly enriched uranium for a nuclear weapon. Now they can do it in a couple of months. That's not in America's interest. That's not in Europe's interest. And so I do hope that the negotiations, which I think are actually continuing this week in Vienna, will work out a path where the United States and Iran can agree. The United States comes back into the plan, and then Iran. And I think with the one exception, I think Iran, everything they've done can be fairly easily reversed. So you could restore the agreement. And what the Biden administration has said is, let's get back to the JCPOA and then use that as a basis, and then they will try to engage Tehran on other issues. Can you extend certain parts of the JCPOA? Can you address ballistic missile terrorism concerns? But they've been pretty clear, I think, after the first month that Iran doesn't have to commit on those areas to get back to the JCPOA. But I do think more broadly, and you're seeing it in Afghanistan, is the United States won't walk away from the Middle East, but you may see some reduction in U.S. attention to the Middle East, particularly in the military area, because the U.S. now is looking at, and this is one thing where I believe the Biden administration accepts the logic of the Trump administration, which is, in security terms, the major security challenge of the United States is now peer competition from China and Russia. And so if you're going to manage to address those challenges in a more coherent way, you have to cut back some of your investments elsewhere. And that may mean some reduction of American attention to the Middle East. Now, I know Europe has equities there. So this is one where I would think, and I would hope that it won't be the United States making unilateral decisions. I think the decisions will be consulted so that Europe has some understanding where the US is going. I think on the other question on digitalization, innovation, quantum technology, all these things around Stanford that I don't pretend to understand, I think there are potential. There's a real potential for some cooperation. Although it won't be easy, because I think on some of these issues, like privacy issues, there are differences between how the U.S. government and Europe have approached those. But I think those would be issues that it would make logical sense to begin to explore and see if we could come to some sort of common understanding that would result in rules of the road. In part because if the United States and Europe can reach that kind of agreement, we may be able to sort of set the rules for a good part of the rest of the world. That's the advantage that the two countries have by virtue of their economic size, or not the two countries, but the United States and Europe have.
So I guess as a bottom line, it's all about priorities, and maybe the US is kind of defining their priorities in a very quickly, and for Europe it's maybe a bit more difficult to do that. So with that, we unfortunately already have to close our session. And thank you very much to our guests. I'm pretty sure that David Deißner wants to say a couple of words as well. And thank you for the audience for the questions. It was fun and very interesting.
Well, just a brief remark of gratitude. Thank you so much, Ambassador Pfeiffer. It was fantastic and very instructive. We learned a lot. Thank you so much. Also to you, Annett, for your very thoughtful questions and great preparation. It's always good if we have a pro to moderate these sessions. Thank you very much to all our members for your great questions.